So that Isser extends to other things beyond just Hilchos Shabbos, okay? So that's an important principle that applies to all portions of the Shulchan Aruch. But beyond that, we saw a very subtle distinction. If you give something to a Gentile that's usher for you but mutter for him, and you don't give him any instruction at all, he can do whatever he wants, okay? But if you give him an instruction that he should specifically do something that for you is usher, and it comes from you, even if you're giving it to him as a gift, like if you give a Gentile basar and chalav, meat and milk, and you tell him cook the meat and milk together. So by giving him that instruction, that becomes at least rabbinically prohibited. Okay, and so as it applies to our discussion over here, you're not allowed to tell a Gentile to muzzle my cow, your cow, ox, whatever the animal is. So we saw 3 different permutations of this.
Before going to that, the example you just gave about the milk, that unique, right? And just the benefit aspect. If you gave him pork and said, cook it out for yourself.
There's nothing wrong with that. There's no prohibition of.
No, you're not allowed to eat.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with telling him I can do the act of cooking. I'm allowed to cook pork.
Okay, so it was
but it's for that very reason, because the activity that I'm advocating that he do, it would be usher for me to do it. I'm allowed to even feed him non-kosher food. But if I'm asking him to do an action that for me would be, that's not an ingestion action, but just to produce something, that for me it would be usher to produce, so then it's I'm violating a halacha. So what do you mean? I guess if I'm working in a Gentile's house, there's nothing wrong with it. Yeah. There may be a problem of a Jew cooking pork in a restaurant, let's say. Can a Jew work in a non-kosher restaurant? And so there are a couple of issues that come up. Number one is that invariably you'll be serving Jews. Yeah. And that's probably the most, that's probably the biggest issue that you can come up with. But if let's say you were working in a place, let's say you're working in China, right? And I don't know, somewhere where there are no Jews. I don't know if maybe there are Jews in China, but I'm saying if you work in a place where you know that you're not going to be serving any Jews, then technically I don't think that there's any, the only prohibition would be as if you're being asked to cook milk and meat together. Okay. It's also, there may be also rabbinic prohibition of doing business with pork. There is a long-standing tradition that a Jew is not allowed to trade in pork and pig and things like that. Okay. I believe that's brought down in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch somewhere. Okay, Usser, so we saw yesterday, so the first one is you're not allowed to tell a Gentile to muzzle your own cow or ox, even if he is doing the work for his own field. Okay, so that was the first case. So just like on Shabbos, you're not allowed to tell a Gentile, take this meat and cook it for yourself, because on Shabbos, right, you're advocating for him to do an activity for himself that for you is prohibited. Let's see. Certainly, you're not allowed to tell. A second case that we saw is where the animal is not the Jews, but the animal is the Gentiles, but the work is being done for the Jew. So you're not allowed to instruct the Gentile, muzzle the animal while you're working on my field with your animal. That you're not allowed to tell him. That was case number 2. And that's also prohibited. But what you are allowed to tell a Gentile is to take his own animal and working on his own field. So there's no Jew involved as far as ownership whatsoever. take your own animal, work on your own field, and muzzle the animal, because there's no prohibition for a Gentile to muzzle his animal. Then the fourth case that we saw is if a Jew is working for a Gentile. Let's see, let me make sure I'm not skipping something. All right, third case is that a Jew who works for a Gentile and the Gentile has muzzled the animal, a Jew is not allowed to work with that animal, even if even if the field is not his and the animal is not his. But if he's working the animal, he's not allowed to work with the muzzled animal. Okay. And then the last thing that we saw in this halacha is that if a Jew is working for a Gentile, is he allowed to eat the produce, since the Gentile has no obligation of unmuzzling, which equates to allowing an employee to eat the produce, right? So does a Jew have the right to eat the produce while he's working in the field? And the answer is no, unless he gets express permission from the Gentile owner. Okay, so now let's go on to the continuing in the Imrei Yaakov. So we saw Kuf Mem Hey yesterday, and we saw this halacha of Kuf Mem Vaz, that you're not allowed to tell a Gentile, take this meat on Shabbos and cook it today. But we said, you're allowed to give a Gentile non-kosher food to eat. Because it's clear that the Gentile is cooking it for his own purposes. So since I'm giving you something that you're going to be consuming, it's self-evident that I'm not involved in this process at all. If I give you non-kosher food to eat during the week, that I'm allowed to do. It's clear that you're not, that it's not for the Jew. There's no connection to the Jew, and it's not a work product that the Gentile is producing. But over here, when you tell a Gentile to do something for you, in the case of chasim, in the case of muzzling your animal, or in the case of where you give your animal to the Gentile, since the Jew cannot muzzle the animal or cook on Shabbos, it's now creating a connection that the rabbis prohibited, lest you come to do it yourself next time. If I tell a Gentile, cook the food for yourself on Shabbos, ayin el yarabba shochiach mitosvus v'harosh, da'af be'erev Shabbos asur litin lenachri v'lo malo sheyavashel b'Shabbos la'atzma. The Mishnah Berurah is quoted over here and says that even if you tell the Gentile before Shabbos, cook this meat on Shabbos for yourself, it's going to be asur. Okay. Let's go on. Avol Yisrael asur meleches hagoy v'hapara shel goy. But in a situation, let's see, where is this going on? In Al Chasima, Aval Yisrael asur lasos bepara chasuma pilu meleches hagoy v'hapara shel goy. That a Jew is not allowed to work with a muzzled animal. V'yesh bo iser Torah de lo sachsom stam ksiv. And there's a biblical prohibition. If I, as a Jew, work with a muzzled animal, even though the field is not mine and the animal is not mine, there's even a biblical prohibition, because the Torah doesn't say that the animal has to belong to you. It just says do not work with a muzzled animal. Okay. Next. Asur lechol shalom midas hanachri. You're not allowed to eat without the knowledge or the consent of, I have to print up a new packet, eh? Okay. Without the consent of the Gentile. Kain kasav hashach, simin shin lamed zayin sifkat and aleph, dezen nechshav kegezel. If I'm working for a Gentile out in his field, he has no obligation to keep me unmuzzled. So therefore, I don't have an automatic right to eat from his food. And if I do, then I'm liable for stealing, according to the Shach. Kevin dahanachri eno mitzuva b'mitzvazu. Since the Gentile is not commanded to observe this mitzvah. V'chein hi girsas haritva b'sug yesham, and that's how the Ritva learns. Aval lefi hanusach shelafanenu pirush Rashi v'haritva harambam nira ikar delo kahashach. He says, however, we have a different girsa in that Gemara, and there are a number of Rishonim who learn according to our girsa, and therefore it would turn out that the Shach is mistaken, and a Jew does have a right to nibble even when he's working for a Gentile. Umichol makom gam lefi zeh ein lahater benachri yoser mibi Yisrael v'lachein mutalo rak lechol aval aser litein letoch kelav. According to those other poskim, a Jew would be allowed to nibble while he's working, but still would not be allowed to put anything in his satchel and take it home with him. Okay. Now let's take a look at some of the likutim. In the previous page, he says, "Va'amira legoy asura b'chol ha'isurim shebetorah." Instructing a Gentile is prohibited in all prohibitions in the Torah, not just in Hilchos Shabbos. Kasaf ha'pri megadim nistapakti im be'isur derabanan bishar isurim asru chazal legoy olav. He says, I'm not sure whether the rabbis would prohibit instructing a Gentile to do a rabbinic prohibition, because we know that that's called a shvus lishvus. So if those in the Smichas Chaver program, that's one rabbinic prohibition slapped onto another rabbinic prohibition. And he says that's normally not done. So he says, Gabe Shabbos asur afilu shvus lomer legoy. He says there are many times we are machmir in Hilchos Shabbos to prohibit a shvus lishvus, to slap one rabbinic prohibition on top of another. V'ayin or chaim simin shin zayin sifhei. He says va'afal gavde le'inyanis or Torah kol sheyesh lav ein chiluk b'kol makom derabanan efshar delo yichmiru kulei hai ad kam lashana. So it could be, that while we prohibit biblical prohibitions for me to instruct the Gentile to do it, but if there's only rabbinic prohibitions, let's say I tell him cook chicken and milk together. It's only a rabbinic prohibition. Is that included as well as the prohibition of cooking meat and milk? V'achida noket lahatir b'pashtus b'shar isurim derabbanan. And the chida says straight out that you can be completely lenient. Odchas of Shama Pri Megadim, V'hinei Yisrael sheyesh lo shor v'chamor v'avdo goy. If a Jew has an ox or a donkey, and he has a Gentile servant or butler or whatever it is, manhigam v'masa b'ya'aru chedoma pshita da'aser shebishlichuso shel Yisrael oseh v'amira la'akum shvus. So I think what he's referring to is that the Torah says that lo sacharosh b'shor uvachamor yachdav. You're not allowed to plow together with an ox and a donkey together. So if you have a Gentile of yours who decides that he's going to saddle the two together so that they can schlep something through the forest, that's not permitted, because even though he is doing it on his own initiative, but if he's doing it for you, that's considered to be amira la'akum. You're giving permission to a Gentile to violate the Torah, and that's not permitted. So,
because they're your animals.
Yeah, it seems like they're your animals.
Yes, if they weren't your animals, well, I'm thinking about the situation we talked about before, where tell the goy to do the dishes, and they use the hot water instead of the cold. You didn't tell them that, and that's fine because it just is their choice. So here they're choosing to plow, even though you're benefiting, like you benefit with clean dishes, but he's just doing it in the way that suits him. But I guess it's because it's your animal.
I think, yeah, I hear I hear the analogy. It's a good point. I think you're right. I think it's because the animals belong to you, and he's actively, and it's very, very visible also that the issur that he's doing. Maybe.
As we say about the dishwasher.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Okay. There's a long biurim over here. Okay. Kasav b'shalos t'shuvas chavos yoyer umikol makom im Yisrael sheyesh lo eitz munach al sfas hanohar. Let's say a Jew owns some property and there's a river running through his property, and he's got a log that's blocking the mouth of the river. Nearly demuter afilu lomar lagoy likach behemosav lahavilo eitzo lebesa. It seems that it would be permitted to tell a Gentile to go and bring the log back to his house. I guess the log has value. Even though you know that the Gentile is going to be saddling together his horse and his ox. And he's going to be pulled because this log is very heavy. You can't, one animal is not going to suffice. He's going to need two animals, and he's going to be employing both animals in order to pull this log out of the river. It's still permitted, like this is what you were talking about, Paul. It's still permitted to tell him, please get me the log out of the river. He says, Ki ein ha-Yehudi nehene migufa iser, because the Jew is not benefiting from the prohibition of working with an ox and a horse together. Bahavi ba'avodaso tarud l'tzarach atzma. The Gentile's doing it for his own benefit to get the log out. This is interesting. So it's almost like saying, wash the dishes, and I don't care how you do it. You can either use cold water or hot water. He says, and this is true. Now, this is contradicting what we saw in the Likutim. So we're going to see he may come off of this. Even he says that Chavos Yair says that you could even instruct the Gentile, Bob, I know you only have a horse and an ox. Bring them both because it's a heavy load, and you're going to need to schlep this. He says, "Velo dami lenosein behemta lugoy laharvia, o sheomer lo chasom parasi v'dosh ba'da'aser." And he says that it's not similar to giving over your animal to a Gentile to laharvia, to, I guess, maybe to crossbreed the animal, which is prohibited. Or if you're telling a Gentile, muzzle my cow and work with it, he says that's prohibited. He says the afal gab shahagoy osa letzorach atzmo lana also shari kibesimin reish sadi zayin hanal. Okay, I'm going to skip the brackets. The sham shaha Yisrael mekabel hana b'didei migufa iser. He says in that situation, the Jew is getting benefit from his own animal. And from the action itself. Because the animal, let's say, if you give your animal over to a Gentile to castrate, or to be mounted, or to, I'm not sure, there may be some benefit to the animal in that process, or a benefit to the Jew in that process, or it's muzzled and it's threshing your grain. He says there's benefit to having the animal muzzled. So he says, but over here, you're not benefiting from the fact that the goy is strapping the donkey or the horse and the ox together. All you want is for him to get you your log, your big piece of wood. And I don't care how you do it. I don't care whether you want to get a train of oxen, a train of horses, or mix horses and oxen together. He says, in that situation, it's like telling the goy to wash the dishes, is essentially what the Chavos Yair is advocating. The afal pisha mitzvah sheyikach sus b'shor shalom mipnei sheyodea she'en mitzaveh sheyikach sus b'shor shalom mipnei sheyodea she'en lo zulasam. He says, and even though you're telling him, I know you only have a horse and an ox, you better bring them both, and you're telling him to bring both of them. Lo mikri nena min ha'isr ad kam loshono ha'chavos yair. He says, but since you're not benefiting directly from that specific action of mixing the two animals together for work, but you just realize that in this particular instance, it's the only way that this particular person is going to be able to get my log out of the river, but it could have been done some other way. So then you're not directly benefiting from the fact that he's working with both animals together. That's right. It could
another way as well.
Yeah.
Pair of oxen.
It could be a pair of oxen. It could be a pair of horses. But this particular guy only has an oxen and a horse. He could, yeah. Yeah, that's right. There are other ways to get the log out of the river, and so that's the argument of the Chavos Yair. He says, in a situation where you're getting direct benefit, like you tell the goy, go ahead and thresh my grain with my animal, but muzzle it first, because you're not commanded on muzzling. He says, I'm directly benefiting from the fact that I'm saving grain that the animal would normally have eaten. So that's going to be usher. But over here, I don't need the log to be specifically removed by an ox and a horse. It could be removed anyway. But the Pri Megadim does not agree with the Chavos Yair. Shakasav Psicha Hilchos Yom Tov, because he writes the opposite, and that's what we saw in the Likutim below. He says, "V'hinei Yisrael sheyesh lo shor b'chamor va'avdo goy," that if a Jew owns an ox and a donkey, and he has an employee or a servant who's a Gentile, manhigam b'masa b'yarech adoma pshita da'aser. He says if the Gentile chooses of his own volition to take them out and schlep stuff on the backs of the two animals together, then that's not permitted. Because he's acting at the behest of the Jew. And therefore you're not allowed to tell a Gentile, you're not allowed to instruct the Gentile or have him do work for you in that way. He says it seems clear that according to the Pri Megadim, what the Chavos Yair says is mutter, the Pri Megadim says is aser. Aval nira de'ein misham raya, but it could be that it's not comparable. The Pri Megadim mayri hecha shehagoy manin kilayim shel Yisrael b'shlichuso da behemo shayacham liYisrael. He says because in the case of the Pri Megadim, the animals belong to the Jew, and therefore uvazeh spirlei the havi kaomer lagoy chasom parasi v'doshba dekaimelon de aser. So therefore, maybe that's the reason why the Pri Megadim holds specifically over there that it's aser, because it's like telling a Gentile, muzzle my animal. Okay? Even when the Jew is not benefiting, like we saw before, if the animal belongs to the Jew, you can't tell a Gentile to muzzle the animal. But the Chavos Yair is talking about a case where the animals in question belong to the Gentile. They're owned by the Gentile. And I just call up Bob and I say, do me a favor, I need to get this log out of the river. Can you bring it? Can you have your animals pull it out? And so the guy says, well, I'll have to get both of my animals. And I say to him, fine, whatever animals you need to take, take. So he says, and that's why the Chavos Yar says you're not benefiting from the Isser. And so without going into all of the detail, let me cut to the chase, because it is a very long piece. Okay. He says, Umeha mevur le'el, based on all of that, what we've explained above, yesh lifshot, we could come to the following conclusion. Hadamatzui b'mostos tziburiyim ulamot abate malon, shahanochim shotfim kelim b'Shabbos. He says, in industrial situations, such as hotels, where Gentiles are, or halls, social halls, wedding halls and things like that, the Gentiles are going to be washing the dishes on Shabbos. And they're going to be mopping the floors after, let's say, the hotel hosts a meal. So it'll be clean the next day. And this is necessary. That as long as the Gentile can do the work without violating Shabbos, nylon, such as pouring the water, the soapy water on the floor, and then brushing it with a nylon brush, which does not absorb. So there's no schita involved. And then to wipe the floor clean with a towel. Since in theory the Gentile doesn't have to violate Shabbos, and I instruct them to clean the floors, and they could do it any way they want, so doesn't necessarily have to violate Shabbos. It says so if the Gentile decides on his own to use a mop and squeeze out the mop, so it doesn't. That's fine. Kaven shehu osazos rak adait is an option because he's doing it for himself, like the dishes example. Lahakel alatzmo abodaso. Similarly, washing dishes. This is something we learned in the Smichas Chaber program, that if he can wash the dishes in a permissible fashion without doing malacha, then it's totally fine. And the only time that the Pri Megadim had this problem is if you're using the animals, right, the property of the Jew in a very conspicuous way, to do something that's prohibited. But with Meleches Shabbos, right, even if you're using the mop that belongs to the Jewish hotel, it's the Gentile's sort of prerogative to do it any way he wants. Aval im meleches ba'avodas ha'akum zeh davar she'efshel la'asos rak al yidei chilul Shabbos. But if the only way the Gentile can get the job done is through Shabbos violation, v'lo shayach la'asos b'derech heter, and there's no way to do it in a permissible fashion, as asr la'akum la'asos dezev habi kebishlichuso shel Yisrael. So then the Gentile is not permitted to do it because he's acting as the proxy of the Jew. The greasy pots, right? The really super greasy pots. Okay, so we'll hold it here. We'll hold it here for today. I'll have to send you out a new packet because we're going to go weiter now. So, okay.
The animals the rest as far as you, which is different than the things that you're belonging.
Does it have to do with that? But this is not a question of resting the animals. This is a question with plowing with two animals on a Wednesday.
I understand. I'm just saying, Shabbos you can't no one else can use your animals. But your animals
Yeah.
have to master. So, I believe.
Yeah, but we're talking about a halacha on a Wednesday.
No, I understand.
I can't instruct the Gentile to take my animals, that one is an ox and one is a horse, plow and work with them together. It's because they're my animals. So it does. I don't believe it's related to the prohibition of do not allow your animals to work on Shabbos. It goes beyond that. It's an issue of that I'm benefiting with my own property. I guess maybe animals is a more conspicuous thing.
So that's why the animals are being harmed by the fact that they have to being molested. So I don't know whether it's because it's your animals as opposed to your Kalim or something.
Mm.
Whether the kindness to your animals since our to your animals generally.
So as I skipped the part where he says that even when the animals belong to the Gentile, it's going to be usher. So you know what? I'll fill in some of the blanks tomorrow. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, sure.